story time. So once upon a time in grade 5, I was going through this really strange phenomenon where like 5 of my adult teeth decided to all come in at once. Now I already had this really weird obsession with when I had a loose tooth, I loved to like pluck it out of my face like berries off of a vine. So as you can imagine, sitting there with 5 loose teeth in my mouth felt like I was in an orchard on a hot summer's day. My brothers had just rewatched The Exorcist with me a few nights before while babysitting, so its cinematic masterpiece was still ever fresh in my mind as I sat there not listening to my teacher drone on about numbers, secretly popping my teeth out with my tongue and letting my mouth fill with blood. Till I noticed my dear old classmate Tristane, who used to eat rulers and pick on me, was staring at me. So I looked him dead in the eyes, opened my mouth slowly and let all of the teeth and blood just dribble out onto the desk. Then I said in a low grumble, "You will die tonight." He started screaming and then I had to go to church.
This is a paranormal story time sent in from a follower called Caden. If anything paranormal scares you, then I would scroll down now. So Caden would always hear thud noises, specifically underneath the staircase when she was alone. She lived by herself, but the thud noises didn't really faze her, considering that she lived in a busy area. Obviously, it used to freak her out, but she used to just sort of ignore it, until one day it changed into footsteps. All of these horrifying noises all happened up until Christmas. Until on the Tuesday, she started getting really weird dreams and no one would believe her or what had happened. Dream number 1. So she was laying in bed and seemed to be having a nightmare until she felt a figure next to her. She couldn't figure out any faces considering it was really dark, but for anything it was like a black cloud. These flashing images kept running through her head until she went to the toilet. A womanly figure was stepping out of the wall. This black cloud would just stand there and stare at her. It felt like something was directly running through her veins. These pictures would not stop running through her head. This womanly ghost was just standing there. I'm running out of... This is part 2 of the paranormal story time. So like I was saying, no one would believe me that this woman was literally following me around. She woke up in my bed and then I saw her in the bathroom. I thought my nightmares couldn't get possibly any worse than this, and then I had my dream number 2. It was almost as if I was looking for a security camera in my bedroom, and I saw the lady in a position on the floor that was so unhumanly and impossible for a human to perfect. She gave me this deafening smile and started running towards me. She was screaming at me, but I couldn't possibly figure out the words because I was so petrified. This woman legit looked like death. The worst part yet was that she was standing right in front of me and I had to jump out my dream. I then woke up, but I honestly don't want to go back to sleep because I'm so scared that this woman's going to kill me. My biggest fear is now unlocked and I honestly don't want to go back to bed. I think I'm going to be...
Story time about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on an all-girls trip. So a little background information, I was 14 or 15 around the time, and it was the summer of my freshman year. So within the last few weeks of my 8th grade year, one of the more popular boys asked me out, and we're gonna call him Carson. I wasn't like super popular at the school, but I was like a medium maybe. But I was raised in a super strict household, where the only phone that I pretty much had was one that was able to call 911 and my parents. And I especially was not allowed to be talking to boys. So Carson had the great idea of giving me his old phone, and throughout the summer, I would text him on there. Well, I started to realize him getting really toxic. Anytime that he would see my Snapchat location change, he would be like, "Where are you going? Why didn't you tell me you were going here?" So I started distancing myself a little bit from him. Also because our relationship was just moving way too fast. Within the first month of us dating, he was talking about wanting to marry me. Like for part 2. Part 2 about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on him on an all-girls trip. So like I said, I started distancing myself from him because he became too attached and was just way too toxic. Well, I was also in a lot of clubs in school, and a few of them would require me to go on trips. Well, the one that I went on was an all-girls trip, and before I left, I texted Carson letting him know that I wouldn't have my phone all week. Well, on the last night of my trip, there was a girls and boys dance. There was like a group of boys from a different school that we were meeting up with. And I tried staying back at the cabin, but they wouldn't let me. So we started doing dances that required partners. So I was pretty much forced to dance with one of the boys. Well, when I came back home, I got 100 texts from Carson calling me a bunch of nasty names, and you can probably guess them. And somebody got a picture of me dancing with one of the boys. And Carson sent it to me and said, "We're done." So after that, I just ignored him. And then literally that night at 1 a.m., he was texting me saying, "I miss you. Please come back to me. Like for part 3. Part 3 about how my ex-boyfriend accused me of cheating on him on an all-girls trip. So like I said, I received over 100 messages from him. He got a picture of me dancing with one of the boys and said, "We're done." And then at 1 a.m, he's like, "I miss you so much. Please don't leave me. Like, I've been doing so bad while you were gone." So of course I didn't accept his apology and I just blocked him on all my social media. And the next day I wake up to messages on my Instagram, my Snapchat, my Facebook. Like, who even uses that? Unless you're talking to family. Well, then Carson decides to tell everybody at my school about how I'm a lying, cheating scumbag. And now, 3 years later, no good guy from my school wants to date me. So now whenever I'm talking to a guy, I have to make sure that they're not affiliated with Carson in any way. But low-key, I had a really good glow-up, so all the hot boys want to talk to me now. And Carson's pretty much still a scumbag.
So the most terrifying thing about the Sally house is that nobody really knows if it's being haunted by a ghost or a demon. The Sally house, located in Atchison, Kansas, has a lengthy history of just terrifying owners, and has also been the source of 2 separate BuzzFeed Unsolveds. And I really think that we should all go there ourselves. But first, let's get into the backstory. The Sally house was built between 1867 and 1871. It was built for Michael C. Finney and his family. This included his wife Kate and his 3 kids, James, Agnes, and Charles. And altogether, they lived in the basement while this was being built. But in the year 1872, Michael ended up passing away in the home. And years later, in 1906, his daughter Agnes moved back into the home. She got married to an engineer named William True, and in 1913, he also passed away in the home. Agnes passed away next in 1939. After this, several families moved in and out of the residence, and there wasn't a whole lot of incidents. But this all changed on December 31st of 1992 when the Pickmans moved in. Tony and Deborah Pickman, who were a newlywed couple and expecting their first child, had no idea what was. So when Tony and Deborah Pickman were moving into the new house, their dog, who was normally very calm, would start to freak out a lot. And to give a little bit of timeline, about January through June of 1993, they would experience things such as lights flickering, cold spots around the home, landline calls dropped, pretty typical haunting stuff. But this honestly seems just common for a home built in the 1800s. Tony had even joked about there being a ghost. Well, in June of 1993, their baby arrived. And this is when things went from a little spooky to terrifying. Electronic toys would turn on and off, the wind-up mobile above his crib would just randomly go off, and he would wake up almost every hour of the night. Deborah describing it as if someone was wanting to play with him. A neighbor actually ended up coming to them and asking them why they left their nursery light on throughout the night, when in reality their son had just been sleeping in their bedroom, so they weren't even in there turning on the light. Deborah's sister ended up coming into town to help with the baby, and she asked why all the baby's toys were on the floor arranged in a circle with backs facing each other. When the Pickmans came up to check in the nursery, they put all the toys back where they came from. They left, turned off the lights, and when they came back to check, they found both the lights on and one of the bears lying flat on his back, just to put the bear back on the chair, and found it on the floor again later. Tony's brother Greg ended up coming over with a camera and asked the spirit if it wanted its picture taken. He snapped a picture of the bear in the nursery, and apparently the bear spun around before their eyes. The grown men were panicked. They were freaked out, ready to leave the house. Deborah was packing up all their stuff while Tony strapped the baby in the carrier. And as he was leaning down to do this, he felt this sharp pain in his back. But because their priority was to get out of there, they didn't look at his back until they got to Tony's parents. Deborah picked up his shirt and he had 3 large scratch marks. So they decided to call psychic Barbara Connor. She came and told the family that the house was being haunted by a girl named Sally. She concluded that she was childish and bratty, but mostly harmless. She'd light candles to show that she was friendly, but she said that Deborah needed to be firm with her. But the reality was far worse. So there was 2 times Sally made herself known. On October 31st of 1993, Tony came home from work on Halloween and turned around to see a little girl standing in his kitchen. She was in church clothes and he realized he could see through her. And he made the connection that this was probably Sally. Previous owners to the house came to the Pickmans and said that their 5-year-old daughter had an imaginary friend named Sally the entire time she was living there. She would be scolded for doing something and she would blame Sally for it, saying that I didn't do that, Sally did, or Sally told me to do that. A photo was made of what Tony had saw and the girl confirmed that that was a Sally from her youth. But the next time Tony saw Sally, it was a horrible nightmare. He woke up to her reaching for him, but he kept finding back and she ended up turning into something that looked more like an animal. It had rotting flesh, worms crawling through it, and it growled at him. Incidences kept happening years after they moved out. Another family moved in and the woman used it for demonic worship, making everything worse. But I'm curious and want to go visit it. My boyfriend and I are on a road trip to the Sally house. Go watch the vlog on my YouTube.
Going to the Sally house. Chills. Brought holy water. This place is apparently demonic. Sally. Does Sally eat chicken nuggets? Picking up on something. This place is eerie and cold. Annabelle. My BF is an expert ghost hunter. Go to my YouTube to watch what happens to us.
As you guys already know, I am so terrified at the fact that some doctors intentionally harm and or kill patients. But I've never really thought about nurses before. I always consider nurses to be like angels on earth, but that is just not the case with Ben Geen, who was not only convicted of murdering 2 patients, but causing bodily harm to 15 others, during only a 3-month period of working at Horton General Hospital in Banbury, Oxfordshire. So how did this all get started? Well, on a non-critical floor in this hospital, many of the patients started to come in with just basic needs, such as something as simple as stitches, and they would go into respiratory failure and be on the brink of death. And these patients really had no prior issues of having breathing problems, so the hospital starts to freak out, wondering why so many non-critical patients are almost dying on them. Like, why are routine things ending up and not being able to breathe? And this caused chaos. Nurses started to blame doctors started to blame nurses, but the one consistency is that Ben always happened to be there. Part 2 on the case of Ben Geen. Well, to provide a little bit of backstory on Ben before his time as a nurse at the hospital, he actually worked for the military and loved combat. This being a very thrill-seeking occupation led a lot of people to believe that he may have been bored now working at this hospital. Anytime a critical case showed up, he was always there to jump on it. He was always there when the more extreme cases occurred. And some of the nurses even started to nickname him after the nurse Beverly, who was also known as the Angel of Death because of how many children she killed as a nurse on purpose. A lot of his colleagues even reported that he always put an act on how much he knew, in addition to having a creepy smile on his face whenever critical situations would occur. He would always assure his colleagues that he just loved saving lives and that this was his passion. And a lot of the patients really loved Ben. He would really get a good rapport with so many of them. But it's speculated that this was hero syndrome, when people do unlawful acts in order to seek heroism. But was this just a correlation, or could they actually prove it? Part 3 on the case of Ben Geen. So let's take a look into some of the patients that came to see Ben. Well, Harold Boss, who was 65 with emphysema, went to go get tests because he was having a bad cough. I guess a basic procedure for this would have been artificial respiration, and many nurses know this. It's pretty common for his diagnosis, but after just minutes with Ben, Harold collapsed. And luckily, they resuscitated him. Another patient named David Long came to see him, who was in totally good health, and then he stopped breathing. David Nelson also came to see him and stopped breathing within his care. And his test found midazolam in his system, a sedative in which he was not prescribed. A 22-year-old came to see him who was totally fine and went into respiratory arrest. And a woman named Herlene Probert came in with only a dislocated shoulder. And when Ben walked in, he asked to flush out her IV drip. And after this, she had to be resuscitated. 2 of the patients that he was convicted for killing was Anthony Bateman and David Onley, who again were just in there for routine things. So he must have been injecting them with something, but what exactly was it? Part 4 to the case of Ben Geen. So whenever you're given sedatives, your respiratory rate slows down, and if given too much, it can put you into arrest. The nurses were suspecting Ben of doing this to the patients, but there was no proof up until Timothy Stubbs. He came in, went to the intensive care unit, and then was getting severe stomach pain. Well, after they tested his urine, they found midazolam and vecuronium in his system, which she was not prescribed, so the hospital staff came together and were trying to figure out how a patient could have gotten this in his system. And the only way this could have been possible is if a nurse or someone had given it to him. So this was enough for the police to finally become involved, and they opened up an investigation. They worked super closely to medical professionals so that they understood the extent of this case. And Ben came in one morning with an emptied syringe in his pocket that had traces of, guess what, you named it, vecuronium. He said he had forgotten about it and meant to put it back in one of those syringe containers on the way out. So he was arrested and eventually found guilty. But was he set up? Part 5 to the case of Ben Geen. So in trial, Ben was trying to say because he was taking up so many shifts, and because he was at the hospital more than others, statistically these accidents would happen more. But the court was not in his favor, and he was given 17 life sentences. Well, the London Innocence Project ended up actually taking up Geen's case. stating that there was a major miscarriage of justice. And a medical statistician stated that no modeling had been done to show that this pattern was unusual. Some medical professionals were even saying that in the case of Dave Onley, one of the people that he was given a sentence for killing, that his heart attack might not have even been triggered by respiratory arrest, but instead liver failure caused by the patient's alcoholism. His friends and family really believed that he was the victim of a witch hunt, like they were blaming him for the hospital's mistakes, or to avoid having a case like Dr. Death, since he was in the media a lot. So do you guys think that he's innocent or not? Some think he's innocent and other people think it's obvious that he did it. Either way, come over to my Instagram if you want to hear about the case of Beverly, the person whose murders they thought he was. Two of the most terrifying dolls to ever exist come down to Robert the doll and Annabelle. And first, we'll just start with Robert. And I'm going to be as respectful as possible when talking about this because apparently if you're not, you could die. That's why Robert's casing is filled with apology notes from people who have had severe bad luck after disrespecting him upon seeing him at the museum. So let's get into Robert's backstory. As you guys know, the movie Chucky, who was based on this homicidal doll, was inspired by the doll Robert. Well, there was this family, the Otto family, and back in the early 1900s, they had a 10-year-old son named Eugene, who was given a doll that was gifted by one of the family servants. Well, this doll is honestly just very creepy. He is 3 feet in length and dressed up in a sailor's costume, and while this is terrifying now, back in the early 1900s, he was just a normal doll. Well, upon receiving the gift of Robert, Eugene got extremely attached to him. He'd bathe him, eat with him, and even sleep with him. I'm debating on seeing if this doll that I have is haunted. I'm a little scared to ask it questions, but maybe we'll try. But first, let's finish Robert's story. So Eugene continued to get more and more attached to this doll. And while this was normal at the age of 10, by the age of 13, it was a little much. His family would walk by his room and hear him talking to Robert. And they would hear Robert respond, but at first they thought Eugene had just made up a voice for him. But one day the mom looked in to hear Robert's voice, which was very deep, and did not see her son's mouth moving. So the father got terrified and was like, hey, you need to stop sleeping with this doll. And trying to convince them, he was like, he might get dirty. But he was just trying to create that separation. And when this happened, they walked back into his room in the middle of the night because they heard screaming and crying. And they walked in to see furniture thrown and his toys mutilated. As time went on, scratches occurred on the wall, things were broken, and Eugene would always blame Robert for these things. The parents were very worried about his attachment to Robert and also the fact that he was blaming Robert for all his mistakes. Things get worse. Well, Eugene's dad comes up with an amazing idea of what to do with this terrifying doll. He takes him away and places him in the attic where no one can see him. But Robert decides to throw parties up there. He would make noises, and when guests would come over, they would hear screaming at night. Neighbors would even claim that they would see Robert move from the attic window. So he was essentially just terrorizing this family. So why exactly was this happening? Apparently, the mom did not treat her servants very well and even walked in on one of them doing black magic. I mean, who knows if this was true, but apparently she saw this and fired her. And as a parting gift, she ended up giving Robert to their son. Potentially doing voodoo on him? I don't know. But these happenings apparently decreased this family's social status by a lot, which was everything back then. Well, Eugene grew up, moved out of the house, and got married. And the family just kept the house and continued to keep Robert up there. Once Eugene's father passed away, he ended up inheriting the house. So Eugene's family moved back into the house around the 1920s. And Eugene found Robert again. So after years of not being attached to Robert, Eugene starts this cycle again. He finds the doll, brings it down to his wife, and is like, hey, here's this doll. And let me tell you, she is terrified of it. She's creeped out. She's like, no. But Eugene essentially introduces Robert as the new member of the family. He brings the doll to work with him. He was a painter, so he would set him up and have him just watch his murals. He took him to dinner and would feed the doll again. And his wife sometimes would hear the giggle of a child and walk by the room to see Robert in there. And then one night Eugene asked if Robert could sleep in their bed, and his wife was like, absolutely not. So he just put him on a chair next to them, and she was getting horrible night terrors. And not only this, but his mood changed just like it did when he was a kid. Instead of tantrums, he would have mood swings and become completely abusive to his wife. But during this time, divorce was considered failure. So they just remained together. And he passed away in 1974. So Robert finds a new child to attach to. Well, during the 70s and 80s, there was this rise of being scared of cults and Satanism. And so when this 10-year-old girl moved in and got extremely obsessed with the doll, such as bathing and eating and sleeping with it, And then the parents would start to hear the deep voice respond to her. They were worried that it was something satanic. So they took Robert straight to the priest, but he ended up bringing them back, and they tried to do the attic thing again. Eventually, it was just given to the East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, where he now resides in a little glass box. But there's so many offerings and apology letters to him because of people disrespecting him and him causing apparently bad luck. And so many workers have reported seeing him move. Either way, Robert, I am so sorry for talking about you. Come over to my YouTube if you guys want to see me find out if my doll is haunted, and also talk to you guys about the Annabelle story. I'm going to be asking her some questions and sharing the original story of Annabelle.
Story time. So once upon a time in grade 5, I was going through this really strange phenomenon where like 5 of my adult teeth decided to all come in at once. Now I already had this really weird obsession with when I had a loose tooth, I loved to like pluck it out of my face like berries off of a vine. So as you can imagine, sitting there with 5 loose teeth in my mouth felt like I was in an orchard on a hot summer's day. My brothers had just rewatched The Exorcist with me a few nights before while babysitting, so its cinematic masterpiece was still ever fresh in my mind as I sat there not listening to my teacher drone on about numbers, secretly popping my teeth out with my tongue and letting my mouth fill with blood. Till I noticed my dear old classmate Tristane, who used to eat rulers and pick on me, was staring at me. So I looked him dead in the eyes, opened my mouth slowly and let all of the teeth and blood just dribble out onto the desk. Then I said in a low grumble, "You will die tonight." He started screaming and then I had to go to church.